The night began with laughter, but it ended with silence. Rain lashed against the tall windows of Ashworth Manor, the ancestral estate perched on a cliff above the restless sea. Inside, the fire burned bright, warming the grand drawing room where 4 figures sat around a polished mahogany table. The air smelled faintly of cigar smoke and old leather, the kind of scent that clung to a house steeped in privilege and history. It was the kind of evening meant for cards, conversation, and perhaps a glass too many of brandy. No one yet suspected it would end in death. At the head of the table sat Lord Henry Ashworth, the patriarch, silver-haired and sharp-eyed despite his 65 years. He was a man who had built his fortune on shipping, a ruthless negotiator who viewed life itself as a series of wagers. Tonight he dealt the cards with precise, almost surgical movements, as though even a friendly game of bridge demanded perfection. To his left was Eleanor Price, a family friend and frequent guest at the manor. She was in her early 50s, elegant, reserved, a widow with a reputation for secrets she never quite revealed. Her gaze lingered on Henry with something unspoken, admiration, resentment, or both. It was impossible to tell. Opposite Henry sat Thomas Blackwell, Henry's nephew and heir apparent. At 32, Thomas carried the easy arrogance of wealth, his tailored suit immaculate, his smile charming yet cold. He had recently returned from abroad, whispers trailing him about debts, affairs, and promises unpaid. Henry tolerated him, but tension simmered like an undercurrent each time they exchanged glances. The fourth player, and perhaps the most unexpected, was Dr. Samuel Whitaker, a local physician who had served the Ashworth family for years. He was younger than Henry but older than Thomas, a solid man in his 40s, with steady hands and a calm demeanor. He was there not simply for companionship, but, some suspected, to keep an eye on Henry's declining health. The cards were dealt. The bidding began. Bridge was a game of strategy, alliances, and trust. 3 things that rarely survived unscathed in this house. The fire crackled. Lightning illuminated the room, and with each round the tension grew sharper. Henry's remarks cut like blades. Thomas responded with thinly veiled mockery. Eleanor tried to keep peace, her voice measured, her eyes darting. Samuel watched, absorbing everything with a physician's patience. Halfway through the game, the storm outside rose in fury. Wind howled through the chimney, rattling the windows in their frames. Yet it was not the storm that unsettled the players, but the sudden shift in Henry. He grew pale, his hand trembling slightly as he reached for his glass. Sweat purled on his forehead. His lips parted as though to speak, but no words emerged. Then, with a violent shudder, Henry Ashworth collapsed forward onto the table, cards scattered, tumbling like dead leaves across the polished surface. His glass tipped, spilling dark brandy that spread like a stain of blood. For a moment, no one moved. The fire hissed, the storm raged, and the silence was suffocating. Then Samuel sprang from his seat, reaching for Henry's wrist, pressing fingers against the pulse point with practiced urgency. He checked the man's breathing, his eyes narrowing in concentration. Finally, he looked up and the words carried a weight that changed everything. "He's gone," Eleanor gasped, covering her mouth with trembling fingers. Thomas leaned back, eyes wide but not entirely shocked, as though some part of him had expected this outcome. The air seemed to thicken, every tick of the grandfather clock echoing like a hammer. But death at a card table was not the strangest thing about the night. What unsettled them all was what lay in Henry's hand when he fell. A single card clutched tightly between stiffening fingers, the Ace of Spades. The card of death. The room froze in eerie recognition. In bridge, cards were meant to be random, shuffled and dealt by chance. Yet this card, so perfectly symbolic, felt deliberate. Too deliberate. Eleanor whispered that it was an omen, her voice barely audible over the storm. Thomas dismissed her superstition but could not mask the unease in his eyes. Samuel placed the card gently on the table, his face unreadable, his mind already working through possibilities. It could have been natural, yes. Henry's heart had been fragile, his temper fierce. But something about the way he fell, the strange pallor that overcame him so suddenly, spoke of more than simple mortality. And there was the card, staring back at them all like a cruel joke from fate, or from someone in that very room. As the storm sealed the manor in darkness and isolation, one truth became clear. Of the 4 who sat down to play, only 3 remained alive, and one of them was a killer. And in the silence after Henry's death, with the Ace of Spades lying on the table like a signature, suspicion turned the card game into something far deadlier than any of them had ever intended. The night was no longer about bridge. It was about survival. The storm did not relent. Rain beat against the windows like fists demanding entry, while the wind moaned through the chimneys as though the sea itself sought to claim Ashworth Manor. In the drawing room, the fire guttered low, its glow barely cutting the gloom. 3 living souls remained seated around the table where Lord Henry Ashworth lay motionless, his face gray and drawn, his hands still curled from the spasm that had seized him in death. The Ace of Spades rested before him, a black omen staring upward, its edges dampened by brandy spilled across the polished wood. The card seemed to mock them all, as though it had been waiting for this moment, placed with precision to mark the exact instant the game ended. Dr. Samuel Whitaker broke the silence first. Rising from his chair, he examined Henry once more, pressing his fingers firmly against the neck, listening for any faint trace of breath. There was none. He drew a long breath of his own and shook his head. "His heart has stopped," he muttered, though in truth he spoke more for himself than for Eleanor or Thomas. "It should not have been so sudden." Eleanor clutched the edge of the table as though she might collapse herself. Her eyes were red, her lips trembling. She whispered Henry's name once, then turned her gaze toward the others, searching for some comfort that was not there. "He cannot be gone like this," she said softly. "Not in the middle of a hand, not without warning." Thomas leaned back in his chair, arms folded, his expression unreadable. A muscle twitched in his jaw, betraying the tension beneath his cultivated calm. "The old man always believed himself immortal," he said at last. Perhaps fate wished to remind him otherwise. His eyes flicked to the card lying on the table, and something almost like amusement passed across his face before vanishing as quickly as it came. Eleanor recoiled at his tone. "You speak as though you expected this." Thomas turned to her sharply, his smile thin and bitter. "And you, Aunt Eleanor, speak as though you believe in omens." "And I." Henry's heart was weak. "Samuel has said as much in the past." The physician bristled. "I never said it would fail like this. Not without pain, not without warning. Sudden death in a man like Henry deserves scrutiny." His eyes hardened. "And we will give him that." Eleanor's hands trembled as she reached for the bell cord to summon a servant, but Samuel stopped her. "No one will come," he said, glancing toward the darkened corridor beyond the door. "The storm has driven the staff to their quarters. Even if they heard the bell, the east wing is far. We are alone, at least for tonight." The thought chilled them all. Alone in the manor, cut off by rain and wind, trapped with a corpse and the gnawing suspicion that his death was not natural. Samuel moved toward the decanter, lifting the glass Henry had been drinking from. He held it to the light, the liquid within amber and faintly cloudy. He sniffed once, frowned, then poured the contents into the hearth, where the flames hissed in protest. "The taste was wrong," he said simply. "The scent of bitter almonds." Eleanor's gasp filled the silence. "Cyanide?" The doctor gave a single grave nod. "It is unmistakable." Thomas leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "You speak as though someone here poisoned him." Samuel's voice was steady. "I speak as though someone certainly did." The words fell heavy, transforming the room into a courtroom, each glance a silent accusation. 3 people had sat with Henry. 3 people had seen him raise the glass. One of them had slipped death into his drink. Eleanor began to weep, her shoulders shaking. "Who would do such a thing?" she whispered, but the question hung unanswered because they all knew it was rhetorical. The possibilities were too many, the motives too sharp. Henry had been feared as much as loved. He had ruled his family with an iron will, and his wealth cast long shadows. Each of them, in some measure, had reason to see him fall. Thomas's voice carried a bitter edge. If Henry was poisoned, then whoever placed that card in his hand was mocking us all. Do you not see it? The Ace of Spades, the death card. This was no accident. Samuel looked at the body again, unease thickening his features. "It means," he said slowly, "that whoever killed him wishes to play a game with us. And we have only just been dealt in." The grandfather clock in the hall struck 10, its chime echoing like a toll for the dead. The fire crackled, and in that sound each of them seemed to hear an unspoken truth. Henry's death had only begun the night's story. Thomas rose and walked toward the window. Beyond the glass, lightning split the sky, revealing the turbulent sea crashing against the cliffs. His reflection stared back at him, pale, hollow-eyed. "We are trapped here until morning," he said flatly. "The bridge is flooded. Even if we braved the road, the carriages would not make it through." Samuel nodded. "Then until daylight we must guard one another and guard ourselves." He glanced at Henry's still form. The killer may already have chosen a second card to play. Eleanor shivered, drawing her shawl tightly around her shoulders. "We must stay together," she said, her voice urgent. "If we scatter, we invite danger." Thomas turned back, eyes narrowing. "Or perhaps that is exactly what the murderer wishes. Fear will make us predictable. Fear will drive us to mistakes." The storm roared, drowning their words for a moment as though the house itself was listening. Then a sound carried from somewhere deep within the manor, a hollow creak like a door opening in an empty corridor. The three froze, their eyes drawn to the shadows beyond the doorway. "No one should be moving at this hour," Samuel whispered. But the sound came again, unmistakable, a soft but deliberate step across ancient floorboards. The drawing room suddenly felt smaller, the air heavy with dread. 3 people alive, 1 dead, and perhaps another unseen presence moving through the house. The Ace of Spades glared up from the table, daring them to look away. And as lightning split the night once more, illuminating Henry's lifeless face, Eleanor spoke the thought each of them already feared. "This is only the first hand." The storm rolled on into the small hours, drowning the manor in its fury. The 3 survivors huddled close to the fire, though no flame could banish the cold that pressed in from the walls. Henry Ashworth's body remained at the table, his features set in stiff defiance even in death. The Ace of Spades still lay before him, and though Samuel had suggested moving both corpse and card to spare Eleanor's nerves, she had refused with sudden, desperate insistence. "The dead must not be disturbed," she whispered, "not until the morning light." The clock ticked heavily in the hall, each strike dragging minutes into hours. They listened for every sound, every creak of wood, every whisper of draft through the shutters. The earlier steps they had heard beyond the door still haunted them, unclaimed by any of the 3. None dared to search the corridors to confirm what moved there. The thought of another presence, an unseen hand responsible for Henry's death, lay upon them like a weight none could lift. Samuel busied himself with what he knew best: observation. He studied Thomas's expression in the flicker of firelight, the way his nephew's eyes lingered on the brandy decanter now emptied into the hearth, the faint curl of his lips whenever Eleanor wept. Thomas wore arrogance like armor, but arrogance could shield guilt as easily as innocence. Samuel's training told him to catalog details, build evidence, measure behavior. Yet suspicion was not proof, and proof was what the storm denied them. Eleanor sat opposite, her shawl pulled so tight it seemed part of her skin. She muttered prayers under her breath, words snatched from memory in uneven rhythm. Her eyes darted often toward the doorway, as if expecting Henry himself to rise and walk back in. Grief and fear twisted her face, but beneath it Samuel saw something sharper, a dread not of the storm or of death, but of revelation. The hour crept toward midnight when Thomas rose abruptly, pacing the rug with restless steps. His shadow loomed against the paneled wall, flickering long and jagged. "We cannot sit here until morning like frightened children," he said, his voice taut with frustration. "Whoever poisoned Henry is among us, unless you truly believe in ghosts. And if we do nothing, they will strike again." Eleanor flinched, clutching her shawl. "Do not speak so, Thomas. This is no ordinary crime. It feels orchestrated." Her eyes drifted to the card, her voice lowering. The Ace of Spades. As if death itself was invited to the table. Thomas turned, his eyes flashing. "Or perhaps one of us placed it there. Perhaps you, Aunt Eleanor, in some twisted sense of justice." Her gasp broke the room's silence. "How dare you?" Samuel raised a hand, commanding calm. "Accusations without proof will destroy us. If we are to survive this night, we must find evidence." Henry did not fetch his own drink. He did not place that card in his hand. "Someone here knows more than they admit," the storm bellowed, shaking the window panes in their frames. Then from somewhere above them another sound reached their ears, a sharp crack like the snap of wood under strain. The 3 froze, their eyes lifting toward the ceiling. It came again, a deliberate noise. Not the random groan of timber in a storm, but the clear report of footsteps moving across the upper floor. Eleanor trembled violently. "The staff? Perhaps one of them." Samuel shook his head. "The servants' quarters are in the east wing. That sound is above us near the master bedrooms." Thomas's jaw tightened. "Then we are not alone." They rose together, the decision unspoken but shared. Samuel lifted a candle from the mantel, its flame guttering in the draught. Thomas armed himself with a poker from the hearth. Eleanor resisted, shaking her head, but fear of being left behind drove her to follow. The corridors above were darker than the drawing room, their silence heavier. Dust coated the wainscoting, disturbed here and there by faint trails that could have been years old, or hours. The candle's flame cast long shadows across the portraits of Ashworth ancestors, their painted faces grim, eyes watchful. Each step echoed too loud in the silence, each creak of the floorboards a reminder that the house itself seemed to breathe. They reached Henry's bedchamber first. The door stood ajar, the key still in its lock. Samuel pushed it open, the candle revealing a room untouched since the afternoon. The bed was neatly made, the curtains drawn, the scent of tobacco faint in the air. Yet something was wrong. The mirror on the far wall was cracked, a fresh fracture running diagonally across its surface. No storm could have done that. Eleanor drew a sharp breath, her hand clamping over her mouth. "He is still here," she whispered, though who she meant, Henry's spirit or Henry's killer, none could tell. Thomas strode inside, his impatience boiling over. "Enough of this! Whoever plays these games means to frighten us into madness. But I will not," the words cut short. On the bedside table lay another playing card. Face up, waiting, the Queen of Hearts. The three gathered around it, silent in disbelief. The card gleamed in the candlelight, pristine and deliberate. Samuel touched its corner, confirming it was real, not some illusion of the storm. His throat tightened. "The Ace of Spades for Henry," he murmured. "And now the Queen of Hearts. This is not chance." Eleanor swayed, near fainting. "Who will it be for?" The question hung in the air like a curse. The candle guttered and the storm outside roared, but within the chamber the silence was suffocating. Someone had moved through the house unseen, leaving death marked not only by poison but by cards. The game was continuing, and they were the pieces. Samuel steadied himself, his mind racing. This is not only murder, it is theater. Whoever does this wishes to frighten us, to control us. The next victim has already been chosen. Thomas's jaw clenched. His eyes flicked from Eleanor to Samuel, suspicion burning in them both. "Then we had best discover who the dealer is," he said, gripping the poker tighter. "Before the next hand is played." As lightning split the night and thunder shook the glass, Eleanor's whisper barely rose above the storm. "The Queen of Hearts," she said again, her voice breaking. "And there are only two queens in this house." The candle's flame quivered, shadows clawed across the cracked mirror, and for the first time, Samuel felt the stirrings of true dread. The game had only just begun, and the deck was far from finished. The web of secrets. Inspector Graves spent the night piecing through the threads of conversation. But when dawn broke, the house seemed more like a trap than a crime scene. Rain had stopped, yet the air carried the same heaviness as though the storm hadn't left. The four remaining players, Mrs. Whitmore, Arthur Bellamy, Margaret Langford, and Dr. Ellery, were restless. Sleep had come in fits, and suspicion grew thicker with every glance across the breakfast table. "Another cup of tea, Inspector?" Mrs. Whitmore asked, her voice steady but her hands trembling as she poured. Graves accepted without a word, studying her closely. He had already sensed that beneath her polished exterior lay years of carefully buried truths. Each of the survivors carried secrets, but Mrs. Whitmore seemed especially sharp, like the edge of a concealed blade. Arthur Bellamy, meanwhile, had abandoned his usual bravado. The man who had boasted about investments and golf clubs the night before now sat hunched, nervously fingering his watch chain. Margaret Langford, pale and subdued, kept her eyes fixed on her plate, refusing to look at anyone directly. Dr. Ellery, ever calm, observed them all with the detachment of a surgeon watching his patient squirm. Graves cleared his throat. "Last night a man died while sitting across from you at the bridge table. That means one of you is a murderer, or knows more than you're admitting." Silence. Only the tick of the mantel clock answered. He leaned forward. This wasn't a crime of passion. This was calculated. The cards were dealt, the drink prepared, the moment chosen. "I will uncover how and why." Arthur shifted uneasily. "Surely you don't mean to suggest—" "I don't suggest, Mr. Bellamy, I investigate. And right now every one of you had both opportunity and motive." Later in the drawing room, Graves summoned Margaret first. She walked in slowly, her shoulders tense. "You seemed shaken last night," he began. "I was terrified," she admitted. "Who wouldn't be? One moment we're laughing over a trick of cards. The next Mr. Alden collapses dead beside me." "And yet," Graves said, his gaze piercing, "you barely touched your drink." "Why?" Margaret's lips tightened. "I never drink at these gatherings. Not after what happened to my father. He..." He was ruined by brandy. Graves noted the detail but didn't press further. Instead, he changed tack. What about Mr. Alden? Did you know him well? Not intimately, she said quickly. He was more my aunt's acquaintance. A man of business, mostly. I never trusted him. He had a way of prying into matters that weren't his concern. There it was. A flicker of resentment. Carefully masked but genuine. When Arthur Bellamy entered, Graves studied his nervous fidgeting. You seemed most upset about the interruption to your card game, Graves remarked dryly. Arthur flushed. That's not fair, Inspector. A man died in front of us, but I confess I am not good under pressure. Indeed, and yet you're good enough under pressure to make investments, gamble heavily, and keep secrets from your business partners. Arthur's jaw dropped. Where did you— I make it my business to know, Graves interrupted. And I happen to know Mr. Alden was investigating some financial irregularities linked to your company. If that came to light, you'd lose more than your reputation, Arthur stammered. That doesn't mean I killed him. No, Graves agreed coolly. But it does give you a very strong motive. Dr. Ellery's interview was different. The physician carried himself with calm dignity, even as Graves pressed him. You examined the body first, Graves said. What was your conclusion? Poison, Ellery replied without hesitation. The sudden collapse, the discoloration, it was classic. And the drink? Ellery nodded. Most likely, but it could have been introduced in other ways. The key is that it acted quickly, suggesting it was chosen with precision. Graves narrowed his eyes. A physician's knowledge, perhaps? Ellery met his gaze evenly. Inspector, I have no reason to kill Mr. Alden. Our paths crossed only socially. If you're implying I used my medical expertise to commit murder, you are mistaken. Graves didn't answer. Instead, he scribbled notes, though the suspicion lingered. Finally, Mrs. Whitmore entered, composed as always. Inspector, she said calmly, this is all very distressing. I opened my home in good faith, and now it's tarnished by tragedy. Tragedy, Graves echoed. Or design. Her eyes flashed briefly, then softened. You think me capable of this? A hostess murdering her guest? Graves leaned forward. I think you've hidden things before. You and Mr. Alden were closer than you admit. He had something on you, didn't he? She drew a sharp breath but recovered quickly. You are mistaken. Mr. Alden was a friend. Nothing more. But Graves knew the truth lay somewhere beneath her polished words. As night approached again, Graves paced the lodge's grand hallway, his mind racing. Each suspect carried motive. Financial ruin, resentment, secrets. But opportunity had been shared. Only one had seized it. He paused at the bridge table, still set as it had been during the fatal game. The cards lay scattered, but one detail caught his eye. A faint stain on the edge of a playing card, barely visible in the dim light. He leaned closer, a trace of something dark, not wine. Something else, the inspector smiled grimly. The lodge was beginning to speak, and with its whispers came the truth, that the killer was still among them, watching, waiting, perhaps ready to strike again, before the game was finished. The storm had passed, but the lodge had not softened. Morning light streamed through tall windows, casting long shadows across the drawing room. The bridge table, where laughter had once masked tension, stood silent, an altar to betrayal and death. Inspector Graves moved deliberately around it, his eyes sharp, his thoughts sharper. The four survivors sat uneasily nearby. Mrs. Whitmore, Margaret Langford, Arthur Bellamy, and Dr. Ellery. Each bore the weight of suspicion, yet none had crumbled under questioning. Graves knew he had only one night left to pry open their secrets. The cards of the game, the poisoned glass, the unspoken grudges, all lay in his hands now. He set a fresh deck on the table with a deliberate snap. We will play one more hand, he announced. Not of bridge, but of truth. Each of you will reveal what you've concealed. I suggest honesty, because I already know more than I've said. Arthur Bellamy was the first to protest. This is absurd. I've told you everything. I had nothing to gain from Alden's death. Graves fixed him with a hard stare. On the contrary, you had everything to gain. Mr. Alden was about to expose your fraudulent accounts. You'd have been ruined. Arthur's face turned crimson. Yes, I feared what he knew, but that doesn't mean— Graves cut him off. You had motive, Mr. Bellamy, but not the method. Poison requires precision. You panicked too easily. Arthur slumped in his chair, muttering curses under his breath. Margaret Langford sat rigid, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Graves turned to her. "And you, Miss Langford. Your hatred of Alden was personal. He blackmailed your father, left your family disgraced. You never forgave him." Margaret's lips quivered, but she raised her chin. "I loathed him, yes. I wished him gone. But I could never bring myself to kill. I avoided even the drink he touched." Her words rang with desperation, but Graves sensed truth there, resentment without the cruelty of action. Dr. Ellery leaned back, his expression unreadable. "So we come to me," he said coolly. "You," Graves agreed. "You declared poison as the cause within minutes, almost too quickly. A doctor's knowledge of toxins is precise. You could have slipped the dose in unnoticed." Ellery's gaze was steady. "I could have, but why? I had no quarrel with Alden. If you're looking for a murderer, look among those with grudges, not a physician with nothing to gain." Graves noted the calmness, the confidence. It was either innocence or the assurance of a man who believed himself untouchable. Finally, he turned to Mrs. Whitmore. She sat straight, hands folded, her face a mask of composure. But Graves had studied masks before. "Mrs. Whitmore," he began softly, "you tried hardest to appear untouched by this tragedy. Yet Alden's death shook you more than anyone. Why? Because you knew what he held over you." Her eyes flickered. "That is untrue." "No," Graves said firmly. "Alden had letters. Letters tying you to a scandal from years ago. A scandal that, if revealed, would destroy your family's name. He intended to use them. You could not allow it." The room fell silent. Mrs. Whitmore's hands trembled now, the porcelain surface cracking at last. Graves reached into his pocket and produced the card he had found the night before, the one marked with a faint stain. He laid it on the table like the trump card of a final hand. "This," he said, "bore traces of the same poison found in Alden's glass. A subtle trick. Whoever handled this card most carefully ensured Alden touched it, then lifted his drink immediately after. A sleight of hand during the game itself." He looked directly at Mrs. Whitmore. "You dealt the cards." The words landed like a gavel. Margaret gasped. Arthur muttered, "Good God." Dr. Ellery's eyes narrowed, but he said nothing. Mrs. Whitmore closed her eyes. For a long moment she said nothing, only breathed shallowly. Then she spoke, voice low but clear. "Yes, I dealt the cards. And yes, I slipped the poison. He deserved it. Adrian Alden was a vulture, a blackmailer, a man who lived on the misery of others. He had destroyed families, ruined lives, and he held my past like a knife to my throat. I could not, would not, let him win again." She opened her eyes, shining with unshed tears but blazing with defiance. "I did what I had to do." Graves stood tall. "You turned a game into execution. You used trust as your weapon. That makes you a murderer." Mrs. Whitmore smiled faintly, almost sadly. "Perhaps. But for once, Inspector, I won the hand." The room fell into silence. Outside, the sun broke fully through the clouds, illuminating the bridge table where fate had been decided. Hours later, as Mrs. Whitmore was led away, the others sat in stunned quiet. Graves remained by the table, the deck still spread before him. The game had ended, but its echoes would linger in each of them forever. He gathered the cards into a neat pile, slid them into their box, and placed them in his coat pocket. "Every game," he murmured, "has its winner and its price." With that, Inspector Graves stepped out into the morning, leaving the lodge behind. But the memory of the night's deadly hand, the cards of death, would never fade.